Why don't octopus rule the world? This seems at first like a somewhat ridiculous question, because it's sort of seems very like science fiction and fantasy, but I can assure you that there actually is some depth to it beyond being sort of silly and outlandish. And although I have sort of presented some bizarre illustrations of what our octopus rulers might look like if they had sort of taken over the planet, um, the question sort of stems from, to me, I asked it because you do sort of see these depictions of very powerful octopi in media. You have, your Lovecraftian Cthulhu, for all my D&D players out there, you have, the flayers are perhaps one of the most powerful creatures from that game. And, Squidward, I assume, sort of has some power that he enacts from time to time. But there actually is more than just sort of a silly science fiction basis, kind of capitalizing on how weird octopi look and how sort of otherworldly they are. It is theorized by many scientists that had octopi actually uh, evolved certain features, they could have become the dominant species had humans not sort of gotten to it first. And that's a big ask because humans are, without a doubt, one of the most unique species because we are so like complex and um, above other animals on the food chain and have such a high level of sapience. So for this to sort of be a contender to us is a big deal. Also, going forward, if you're curious, octopi versus octopus's discourse, it's actually, you can use it interchangeably. It's from a Greek word, not a Latin one, so the octopi doesn't apply. So say whatever you want. I'll just sort of switch between them here and there. But what makes octopi so special? I'm talking on and on about it. Well, you can sort of start just off the base of it. They look weird. They have this very unique morphology. Um, and this sort of stems from the fact that octopi are relatives of mollusks, and which include things like clams and snails, even the ones that you see on land. But instead of sort of opting for that hard shell to keep them safe and as a means of protection, they have developed a very intricate nervous system that extends all the way through their tentacles and can exist in a way that each arm has kind of a mind of its own and can act independently while giving signals back to the central brain so that it can process information around itself even faster and it can multitask at an extremely fast rate. So right off the bat, this sounds a bit like an alien invader. It sounds like something, because a lot of people say octopus essentially have 9 brains. But if that's not enough, they have almost these supernatural abilities for camouflage, where not only are they able to mimic colors, but also textures and patterns, which is especially bizarre because they actually are colorblind. So a lot of this is just kind of intuition and learning over time. And the lack of bones, because they are invertebrates, allows them to squeeze through any opening that's larger than their beak. So that it can go as low as 1 inch, meaning that octopus are essentially shape-shifting, adapting, sometimes seemingly invisible creatures that can move through extremely small spaces. To the extent that many octopi escape captivity, and they've been historically difficult to keep in place and study because they are able to do that. Perhaps the most fascinating example of this camouflage at work is there's certain species of mimic octopuses that not only are able to get down patterns, but actively observe and mimic the behavioral movement of certain animals that are more dangerous than themselves to scare off potential predators, mainly ones that are more poisonous than they are. For instance, they are able to mimic the flatfish as it sort of moves on the underbelly, the slithering of these toxic snakes, as well as sort of the movement and formation of the highly poisonous lionfish, which is something that isn't uncommon. There's mimicry all over in nature, but very unique to have it to this level of sort of behavioral mimicry. So they can overcome, they can adapt, they sort of do have this invasion of the body snatchers type thing going on. So what is it exactly that brings it even further is that octopus are highly intelligent creatures and highly emotional ones. They, going back to that camouflage, they change color with emotion and as a means of communicating, and even have been observed to seemingly dream. in how they sort of sporadically change color and pattern as they sleep, which is something that feels very human, that we ourselves don't understand the purpose of dreams, but they're seemingly to unload everything that's going on in our brains. And octopi have a ton going on, where over research that has been done, they're not only able to solve puzzles and mazes as well as open jars, but they improve at them over time. Some octopi sort of start at being able to open a jar in about 5 minutes, and then they go down to as short as under 1 minute. And they are animals capable of using tools. Perhaps the most interesting example, and this is extremely rare in the animal world. I believe less than 1% of animals actually know how to use tools, and it's such a defining human trait. You see this octopus, and it's sort of walking across the seabed, and it manages to find half of a coconut shell. And it starts carrying the shell with it until it finds the other half. And very ironically, seeing that it is a creature that abandoned the shell of its mollusk cousins, it sort of forms a protective armor around it. And not only does it do that, it carries it around with it wherever it goes. Because it identifies that this is a tool. So not only does it know that this is something that can help me, but it understands this could have potential to help me in the future. It is actively making a plan and a goal for itself. And here we sort of see it using the shell as a cover so that it can ambush this creature that it wants to eat. And it's even sort of rolling around in it as a sort of suit of armor as it goes across the ocean floor. So this is all incredibly unique to intelligent creatures that we associate as features of humanity. So all this intensively, should octopi not have taken over? Because they seem to be even smarter at this point than many of the bony fish that believed came out of the water and later turned into mammals and primates. So what stopped them? Well, there's a couple of reasons for it that people most theorize, scientists in particular. Obviously, there is the limit of the underwater. You can't build fire, you can't make very extensive tools. That's huge to human development, because human being able to cook food meant that their food was more nutritious and gave them more energy, or more so they needed to eat less of it to be able to gain the nutritional information. And being able to create energy through fire, all of preserving life is creating energy. So sort of having a tool that in all intents and purposes is an extension of yourself means that you are fundamentally larger and more extensive as a creature. But octopi can create tools. And it does sort of bring to question that, is that really the biggest hindrance? Because yes, octopi can't live on land because they lack a skeleton, so they'd be susceptible to gravity, but ancient forms of cephalopods, which are what the family that octopi are in, did have bone-like structures at some point. And as we've mentioned before, they are related to snails, some of which live on land. So it's not super out of the question to say that they could have at some point evolved a way to go on to our Earth. And I also bring it as an example that evolution is often strange and not necessarily completely linear. For instance, you have dolphins, which are aquatic mammals. Most people believe that they were at some point complete land dwellers. So it's not only is it not a huge leap to say that they can go from ocean to land, but if a creature can go from land to ocean, it's not necessarily a deal breaker. But then you have another point of octopi have famously short lifespans. I've included this photo from the film Finding Dory, because if you've watched it, you know that this character that's an octopus. His name is Hank. And a very interesting behind the scenes detail is that he was so complicated to build new technology necessary for animating like such a difficult creature as an octopus, that if one scene that he was in actively took about 2 years to animate. And the comedy of this is that 2 years is actually as long, and in fact longer than the amount of time that some octopi live. Most octopi cap out at 5 years if they're lucky, and many only go to live a couple months, in fact. This is because octopi, their strategy of reproduction tends to be they release a huge litter with hundreds, close to thousands of octopi, and they just kind of hope that it works out. But at the same time, there is the issue that when they mate, they end up dying. because there's sort of a hardwired genome inside of the octopus that after they mate, the male will sort of go off and die. If he's not eaten by the female, who will often eat him for nutrition, he will sort of scuttle off and die while the female attempts to protect her young, not eating or getting food for herself, never leaving their space until eventually she dies of starvation. However, even on this point, there was a study done by a scientist named Jerome Wodensky, who found that the removal of an optical nerve on the forehead of the octopus resulted in them actually losing this instinct and greatly extending their lifespans. So even then, perhaps a mutation could have happened that caused them to not have this gland, and they could have preserved themselves more and had longer lifespans to live on land. But this is where the kicker comes. And this is the biggest thing that's sort of the difference between octopi and humans in that regard. You sort of see one of them being a wallflower here. They're famously antisocial. They they are not very communal. They tend to be completely by themselves until it comes to mate. And they are also pretty regular cannibals, eating each other on regular rates. So octopi will even sometimes eat their own arms if they're driven to really true starvation. And this sort of goes in the face of the biggest thing that keeps humans alive and made it so that they were able to flourish. The fact that we are extremely social creatures. The fact that humans would spend time with each other, share knowledge, pass it down to their offspring, so that knowledge that they accumulated with their large brains would still be able to move on forward. The issue ultimately lies with an octopus gains all this knowledge, has all this intelligence, is able to learn and grow and be a phenomenally interesting and complex creature, but both cannot live long enough and does not interact enough with its fellow octopi in order to pass that knowledge on. And as such, they don't really develop towards using that knowledge for a higher purpose. So it just goes to show you, why have 8 arms if you don't have anyone to hug? Thank you.